Everybody, good. Everybody's here. Welcome to Kigali Foreign Affairs Council. I want to welcome everybody. Good afternoon. And it's very exciting for the conversation today we have. I want to say thanks to our moderator, Dr. Faraj, the Dean of African Leadership University in Rwanda, and our speaker, former USAID Deputy Administrator, Bonnie. We're very excited to have everybody here. I want to remind you, everybody, two things. One is we're on the record, just everybody want to make sure you know that. And second, our moderator and the speaker, they're going to jump into the conversation for the first 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions the last 10 minutes. So I encourage you to send your question in the text down. You can see where you can send your question, and we'll try to get into as many as possible. Good. So without taking long, I want to welcome Dr. Faraj. Please go ahead and start the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yes, because we're limited time, I want to dive right in. You know, there's a lot on people's mind, a lot going on in the world, but one of the biggest things that's kind of impacting everything, obviously, is the pandemic and COVID-19. And so I was wondering if we could start off just kind of getting some of your thoughts about how COVID long-term will impact the development field.
You know, this is a great question, and it is front and center on everyone's mind. I think one of the things that we're going to be seeing, actually, in fact, we are seeing now, are the secondary and tertiary impacts of COVID-19. And apart from the spread of the disease itself, which is really hitting my own country very hard, what we're seeing is the strains on health systems around the world. What we're going to be looking at worldwide is the distribution of vaccinations, especially to remote areas in developing countries. We've all learned that you're not safe at home if people everywhere else are also not safe. So, you know, I like to refer back not just to doom and gloom, but to good news stories. And when I look at a country like Rwanda, there's a lot of good news in terms of the COVID-19 experience and how Rwanda is capable of handling the outbreak of the pandemic. And so far, and I knock wood, it's been quite successful partnering with the United States. And why is that? And it's, I think, because of highly successful programs that we have undertaken together, programs like what is called PEPFAR, but remember that stands for the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Why does that impact us now with COVID? Well, it's because we've been working together very closely for nearly 20 years to develop and to build robust health systems. And so far, we've been able to collaborate using those systems themselves to ensure, for example, that things like Ebola did not enter Rwanda. You know, as recently as 2019, we were able effectively to combat the arrival of Ebola into Rwanda. So similar efforts with COVID have been taken and will need to be continued to protect populations like Rwanda's population. But I mentioned the secondary and tertiary impacts, and these are going to be felt throughout emerging markets around the world in areas like livelihoods, jobs, economic stagnation, which unfortunately in some countries can lead to outmigration, often of male populations, which can lead then to single parent households with strains on education being offered to children. And again, the livelihoods of single parents who have to simultaneously raise children, often with grandparents or great-grandparents' help, but also always with an eye toward this pandemic. And in areas without access to good connectivity or good technology, then we're looking at a generation of children, sometimes in the world's poorest countries, that don't have access to a good basic education. And when you think about the impacts of that on development, it isn't just the health crisis that we're in, but it's really access to 21st century technologies, capabilities, and growth. And that, I think, is what scares me most probably about the pandemic worldwide.
Mhm. Lots of scary things, but I think you also hinted at a few things that we can be very optimistic about. And I think, when you think about PEPFAR, it's an example of a long-term kind of engagement at primarily the government level. But what we've seen, there's always private sector in there. There's a lot of heavy engagement of private sector in the vaccine trials and rollout. And recently we've seen like Microsoft and other multinationals have been opening UN affairs offices. And so just wondering your thoughts about the importance of engaging the private sector to enhance development solutions.
That is a great question, and it is critical. It's an area that we sometimes refer to as public-private partnerships. And the final P is the critical one there in terms of partnerships. And we're seeing how important that is now more than ever. It's very clear as developed countries are taking on more and more debt to finance the rollout of COVID and to address the impacts on their own populations, like here in the United States. What becomes clear is there is never going to be enough money from governments to solve all of the world's problems. And I would argue too that there aren't necessarily the right kinds of experts in government to solve all of those problems. And so the partnership with private industry is that much more important. For innovation as well as for job creation, governments need to work with the private sector in that public-private partnerships. And these types of connections will be more and more important. I believe that good ideas do not reside only in advanced economies. Good ideas can come from any part of the world. And as we see around the world, the need to engage with people in emerging markets, companies, creative entrepreneurs in emerging markets, partnering with advanced markets is the way that companies and countries will advance and succeed. So it's good to see that companies like Microsoft, which are giants, are opening UN affairs offices. Even better is when we see those companies opening offices in countries around the world, not just based at the UN, but really engaging with the creative flow of ideas and innovation coming out of entrepreneurs everywhere in the world.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. When you speak about government maybe not having the right experts, I'm going to come back to that point because I want to ask a question about OPEC and the new DFC, but I want to go back to something you said in your memo. So I'll come back to that around human capital and hiring and expertise. But so OPEC, about a year ago, they merged with the Development Credit Authority, and so we have this new Development Finance Corporation. So I'm wondering, in your mind, how is that an improvement? What is better about the DFC, and how do you see the DFC having an impact?
So I think the critical piece of the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, is the D, which is its focus is on development. And as DFC gets more and more traction over time, again, it's been operational for just over a year, it will act as a true partner to developing countries to finance development projects and programs that will have a measurable impact on countries and on people. Right now, there's very close coordination between USAID in Washington and the DFC in Washington. But even more important is the close coordination between our USAID missions in over 80 countries around the world and the Development Finance Corporation to generate projects and ideas for financing. And these kinds of ideas are going to come from the field. They're not going to be generated in Washington, D.C. The projects that are the brainchilds and the creative juices of developing countries, emerging markets, those are going to be the things that the United States and other development finance institutions are going to look at and say, this has great possibility for success and for development impact. Let's finance that. So we're working very closely with our aid missions around the world and with citizens of countries around the world to come up with and generate these great ideas for financing.
Wonderful. So it serves to amplify homegrown solutions.
Yeah.
I really like that. So jumping back to the memo, and because there you also talk about, a lot of ideas are generated in the field, or especially I think you drafted, for the audience, you drafted 2 memos for the incoming Biden administration. One was around policy and one more operational. And within the operational one, one of the things you address is the requirement for a master's degree for a lot of roles. And then you have a line in there where you say, does the current hiring model allow USAID to attract the most
Sorry, Dr. Faraj, you froze for a second. So sorry, you had said one of the things I addressed was, and then I think actually I froze. I apologize.
No problem. You addressed having a master's degree requirement for some roles. And you make a point about, does the current model allow USAID to attract the most effective and diverse talent? And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, because I think it also speaks to your idea about where the best ideas come from, the homegrown solutions. So say a little bit more about maybe how not just USAID, but governments and private sector can start to reimagine how they think about talent.
That is a great question, and it causes me heartache when I think about all of the great people who could join USAID, but for some of the requirements for joining the cadre of foreign service officers of USAID. I was a foreign service officer in the Department of State when I started my career. I don't know that I realized at the time that there were distinct requirements between the foreign service officers from USAID and those from the State Department. In order to join the State Department, you needed 2 things. To be an American diplomat, you needed to be at least 20 years old, and you needed to be an American citizen. And those were the only requirements. And then you had to pass a series of exams. Fine, but the only barrier to entry was that you had to be 20 and you had to be an American citizen. And it turns out that USAID has been imposing a requirement that is not actually a requirement per USAID policy, but it has been a soft requirement that in order to join USAID's foreign service, you need to have a master's degree. What that's led to, especially as master's programs are more and more expensive over time, what that's led to is a highly non-diverse cadre of leaders at USAID. It is shockingly one of the least diverse workforces at the senior levels in the US government. And I look at that and say, if you all think the same and talk the same and went to the same universities and have the same master's degree, you're not necessarily generating over time the best ideas. Do you really need that for some of the areas where USAID is focusing? For a humanitarian assistance program, do you need to have a master's degree in French history? I don't think so. To deliver food assistance around the world, maybe you need to have military experience even in logistics, or maybe you need to be a creative supply chain engineer. These are the kinds of things that warrant a rethinking of what the workforce of the 21st century should look like. Do you even need a college degree if you have hands-on experience and you just didn't thrive in a college environment? So these are the kinds of things that when you look at two different types of foreign service in the United States, the Department of State and USAID, maybe there's a middle ground that makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated those notes in the memo, because it really speaks to people kind of reimagining how they think about hiring, how to think about talent, and really trying to address the 21st century needs, not necessarily what the model might have been like 20 or 50 years ago. And in line with that, I know you've also really made a push for technology in humanitarian assistance. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and how you see tech reshaping the development sector.
Well, tech isn't just reshaping development. Tech is reshaping everything that we do now. And the funny sort of confluence of events, I spent almost my first year at USAID focusing on getting into a final format, what the agency's digital strategy should look like. How should USAID of the 21st century approach digital technology? And just as we were getting ready to roll out the digital strategy in a big event at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, COVID hit. And so we couldn't have this big event inviting 200 people from Washington, D.C. to come and listen to my pearls of wisdom. Bummer. We launched it online. And at the launch, we had 4,000 people participate, and we've since had thousands more people view the launch of the digital strategy. Well, maybe that original thinking of having 200 muckety mucks from Washington, D.C. show up wasn't the best approach to a launch of a digital strategy. So digital is in everything that we do. When you think about the use of digital technology in a humanitarian response now, we're looking at things like, what is the best way to do a few things? If a humanitarian response is in response to a natural disaster, say an earthquake, what is critically important immediately is reestablishing connectivity. And if there are solutions for connectivity in the country that's impacted by this earthquake, so much the better. And if there are solutions that maybe are software-based and can be addressed remotely, rather than hardware-based, which may have been impacted by the earthquake, then a country is in a better position. And so one of the cool things that I'm learning about, we're all learning about, is software-based solutions for things like broadband connectivity. And we'll start to see these roll out in rural communities in the United States, but also into emerging markets where the money isn't there to invest in large-scale broadband hardware, but a much less expensive and equally as effective software-based solution is something that can make an enormous impact on regular life as well as on during a humanitarian crisis. Also, and I'll add one final piece on this specifically related to a crisis situation, and that's that the idea of having protected personal information is really important. During a humanitarian crisis, people are grabbing anything that they can that is most valuable to them in their lives. They're going to grab their children's birth certificates or baptism certificates. They're going to grab just those few things that they know that they need. Ensuring that their personal data is protected as well as ensuring that they are who they say they are, is really important. How do you do that? Well, applying technology to this is probably the easiest way to ensure protection of personally identifiable information. At the same time, and we'll get into this in a little bit, I think, ensuring that that data is protected and not abused is probably even more important. And so that's where technology comes in as both a protector, but also potentially as something that can be abused by malefactors.
Thank you so much on those. I know that we're moving quickly. I know we want to answer some of the questions from some of the participants out there. I have a couple more for you as well. It's difficult covering so much, but all of these things are really critical, I think, as we think about development and just progress. We don't have to always think about these things as separate, because as we talk about with public-private partnerships, there's so much more integration these days in global economies. So you can't think about the development sector as a separate entity from the rest of the progress and development that's happening in the private space in different countries, et cetera. And as we've seen by COVID, we are all impacted by what's happening to our neighbors, et cetera. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat yet.
Yes, I see the questions. 1 second. They're calm down here. All right. So the first one is, in your point of view, what should countries do to mitigate the risk of COVID to the economy?
So if I had an answer to that, the United States economy would be bouncing back in a second. But the answers are multiple, honestly, Yannick, and it's a great question. It's not entirely for governments to address. It really is a time for partnership with private industry. And if we don't have that partnership, we're not going to get the best solutions out there. We'll get a bandage and not a suture. And what we need right now for our economies is a way to address the suturing, the rebuilding from a very vulnerable place. I think it will require additional investment on the part of governments, but it also is a time for civilian populations to start coming up with, or continue to come up with, great ideas for how economies can rebound, how retail can rebound. Retail is what creates jobs. How technology can enable that. That will also create jobs. But I think from an economic rebound perspective, all governments at all levels, national and local levels, have to look at how they can create more jobs. And agriculture is going to be another important area for focus. A lot of parts of the world are seeing that the agriculture sector is impacted because farmers and farm workers are impacted by COVID. So how do we infuse technology into some of that to operationalize farms and agricultural activity in a way that will provide food and sustenance to local markets and then to global markets? So the spectrum is so broad, but it's really a time for a call around the world to people to think as creatively as possible for ways to rebuild their economies.
The next question is from Dr. James, University of Rwanda. What lesson can we learn from COVID crisis? I think you touched on some of those things.
Sorry, I missed that question.
It was from Dr. James, University of Rwanda. The question was, what lesson can we learn from the COVID crisis?
Oh, that's an impossible question because we're learning a lot of lessons. But I think the biggest lesson that we'll learn from this is that no one is safe until everyone's safe. And the criticality of getting vaccinations distributed around the world is more important now than ever. And it's amazing to see countries like Israel, which has done an incredible job of vaccinating. So far, they vaccinated more than 10% of the country, and they're really on track to get vaccinations out to the entire country, as well as then to their neighboring countries. I've been reading great articles about Israeli collaboration, for example, with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in vaccine distribution. That's extraordinary. And a tremendous example of what we should be seeing around the world.
Next one's from Nicole. She asked, could you comment on World Health Organization and the leadership they felt to lead a global response?
You know, the World Health Organization is a very important player in ensuring that world health systems are functioning. And the World Health Organization really failed, I think, in the early stages of COVID by not doing a better job at investigating the outbreak and putting safeguards in place to stop the virus from spreading out of China. So, but now we're a year plus into this, and the World Health Organization has a great opportunity really to redeem itself and to be a leader and to help coordinate with amazing organizations, for example, like Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to distribute vaccines around the world, including to some of the most remote places and some very, very poor countries as well. And so I look to the leadership of the World Health Organization really to step up and to play the significant role that it should have played at the beginning of the outbreak.
Next is from Uera. What should we do in order to turn this crisis into an opportunity once it's over?
I love the question, and I think that that's the best way to look at a crisis. Look, if any country understands how to rebound from crisis, it is Rwanda. And I think that now is an opportunity for the world to look to countries like Rwanda and say, how do we respond? How do we move beyond this? How do we learn lessons from all of these senseless deaths to say, now we're going to be better, and now we're going to have responses in place that allow us to, as a world, respond better and prepare proactively and take advantage of the new landscape that we're all living in. And that new landscape involves new ways of looking at technology. It involves new ways of looking at global health. And it involves new ways of looking at educating our children and caring for our elderly and feeding our populations. These are going to be the opportunities that are out there. And I think it falls to the community of creative thinkers, wherever they are in the world, to come up with what the opportunities look like to respond globally.
Yeah. I think we ran out of time, but I'll take this one quickly. She's been keeping sending this question quickly. What's your advice to the incoming administrations in terms of foreign aid and international development?
So I think where we're ending is where we started, which is the importance of partnering partnering with countries around the world and partnering with private industry. When I was at USAID, one of the things that I really focused on was bringing new partners to the table. And we started working with new donor countries in a way that the United States and really traditional donors hadn't before. Again, going back to this reality that there won't be enough money in developed countries, so-called developed countries, to respond to crises all over the world, we brought new donors to the table. And working with countries like India, which is establishing a new development agency, and Indonesia and Israel and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, countries that weren't always invited to the table, but are key players in response to crises around the world. It'll be a broader landscape than just OECD countries. And that's a good thing. So I think that bringing together this combination of the private sector, new donors, and innovative entrepreneurs is going to be the face of development around the world. And I have to say that the face of development is very diverse now. And that too is a very good thing, to have this what had become, I think, a very traditional role, broadened to include innovation, is something that we'll all benefit from around the world.
Thank you. Dr. Faraj, do you have the last question maybe before we go?
No last questions. I just want to say, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your insights. I mean, it is so relevant and prescient. I think it's interesting that you mentioned, you were developing the digital strategy right before COVID hit, but you guys were well placed. And I think that is the lesson for all of us, that we should really be thinking about the future and preparing for the unknown, because you never know when you're going to be in that situation. So I just really appreciate what you've shared with us today. And thank you, Yannick, for allowing me to be part of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Always good to see you, Bonnie. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this is not too cold. Just hang in there. Just hang in there. And Dr. Faraj, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Have a wonderful evening and morning for you, Bonnie. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. I'm sorry we didn't take all the questions. There's too many questions, but next time in person, we'll take questions when she's in run next time. Thank you.
I look forward to that day so much. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.